Welcome, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us for the Wildlife Awareness webinar this afternoon. I do hope the sun is shining wherever you are. It's gorgeous here in Calgary. So I am Shannon Jarrell. I am the Communications and Training Manager for Western Canadian Spill Services. And I've got Amy Grenier, our training coordinator, helping to facilitate this webinar. So first of all, I would like to address the elephant that's probably in all of our rooms. Normally we would be doing this in a classroom setting, and we would be just going to one co-op to have a meeting with about 100 people. But instead, what we're doing is we're having this webinar, and last check I saw about 72 names, fantastic. And we're able to bring you guys in from 7 different co-ops, 3 zones. So that map there is going to give you an idea of where everybody is coming in from. So first and foremost, attendance at this exercise is going to count towards your regulatory requirement, and you would have received a link to an orientation video. Now, I am told, and I experienced it myself, when you go to do that video, it says this course is not available in English. Well, you know that's not true, because it is. So just please ignore that. But the orientation video is not just for exercise attendees, it's for anyone. So please do go ahead and share that with anyone in your organization. Really, it's meant to be a bit of a brag for member companies and what they do, how you're involved in spill preparedness and how we support you guys for response support. You know what I mean? Anyway, so what you're going to receive at the end of this is you'll get a copy of this presentation, the introduction. You'll also get a PowerPoint presentation of the workshop that we're going to do at the end of this webinar. And that's going to be something that you can add to your toolbox, so you can bring to your safety meetings. In addition, in that orientation video, if you haven't done it yet, please make sure you do. It is part of that attendance tracking. You will learn that the WCSS website really is going to be your most up-to-date source of information. So please refer to that at all times. And then we're going to give you a link specifically to our app. We do have, we do have an app that we've developed, and it's meant for folks who are in the field and need to be making some really quick decisions and don't really have the time to be flipping through that big yellow binder. So that's what the app is based on. It's an excellent tool, and it's a great safety meeting topic as well. So that page is exactly where you're going to find the app. It's the only place it's available for download. Also, you would have received a link to the wildlife management video. I hope everyone's had a chance to have a look at that. And you might have had a glimpse of other videos that we've been creating and making available. So again, I kind of think that your safety topics are pretty well set, possibly for the whole year. We don't know, but we do love your feedback. So please go ahead, watch all those videos, share them with your folks, and let us know what you think. You will also receive your certificate of attendance once we know you've completed that orientation and this webinar. And that will be for auditing purposes. When your regulator needs to know that you've attended an exercise, that's what you want to show them. And then finally, as with any co-op exercise, we do have debrief questions. So Amy will send a link to those survey questions. There'll be some reflective and some more just to ensure that we're on the right track for meeting your training needs. So just a brief overview of what we're going to go through. After my few slides here, I'm going to have each co-op chair and alternate chair introduce themselves, as well as the equipment type and location specific to their co-op area. That will get you a little more familiar with what you've got near you. Then we're going to have our guest speakers, Holly Lillie from Alberta Institute for Wildlife Conservation. She's going to discuss oiled wildlife handling. And then we'll carry on with Sherree Dallyn from Ridgeline Canada. And she's going to talk about your defensive options with and without authorization when you're dealing with wildlife at a spill site. And then after that, Sherree will lead us through the workshop that will then become part of your arsenal. at the end of this webinar. So just a couple of housekeeping items. Thank you so much for adapting so quickly. We do appreciate you keeping your video and video off and yourself muted, just so that we can really soak up all that bandwidth. We do encourage questions, so please do that whenever the question occurs in your mind. Use that chat function. So down at the bottom of your screen, you should see a little sign that says chat. Open that up, open that window up if you haven't already. And when you have a question, just type question first, so that we can track that and ask them in order. If you're not really feeling like you want to be showing your question to everybody, go ahead and find Amy Grenier's name, and you can message her privately. She will ask your question for you. But just know that we will address those questions at the end of each presentation. And finally, we love reactions and comments. In particular, we love joy, hands clapping, and ta-da. But if you want to use other ones, that's fine. Please just know that that we want to let our presenters know that they're doing a great job. So let them know that. And with that, just before I allow Scott to introduce himself from Area P, I just want to point out that it's been about 10 years in the making that WCSS has identified that our member companies really have a need for wildlife management support at spill sites. And so for that reason, we now have 8 different wildlife response units that are spread out throughout our jurisdictional boundary, and they're available for you to use. You're welcome to check out the inventory on the website anytime and inquire with us. Offer us suggestions. We love those. But more than that, I also think that the importance of webinars such as these keeps that conversation going, and it keeps information consistent. And it also brings forward resources that you might not have known you actually have at your fingertips. So folks like Holly and Sherree are going to be excellent resources. You're going to want to put their information in your internal company resource list. You're also going to want to check out these chairs and alternate chairs. These guys are fantastic, and we would not be where we are without them. They really keep us rolling. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Scott Andrews from Area P. Go right ahead.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Scott Andrews. I am the current chair of Area P and the alt chair for Zone 1. I represent former Husky and now New Synovus. I've been doing this for about 15 years. I specialize in spill response and preparedness for the last 3 with Husky and now with Synovus. I've been with WCSS for about 3 years. And as you can see, I'm going to be giving up those area chairs and will be the income and cap rep on the board of directors. Something that I've learned from spill response, it is a diversified field. There's lots of things that we need to know when it comes to spill management. Each spill needs assessment and reassessment constantly to meet the changing needs of the environment and of the priorities coming down. Understanding, training, and competency is the key to the overall effectiveness of a response, and ongoing management of any spill program is really important. So with that, we'll move on to the equipment. There we go. So this is in Area P. What we have is a 52-foot Oscar trailer, a 16-foot wildlife trailer. There's 2 work boats in the area. We have 40 feet of boom cache in a sea can and the hydraulic drum skimmer with a power pack.
Okay, thanks, Scott. On to Mike.
Sounds good. Hey guys, my name is Mike Peacock. I work for Crescent Point Energy. Been in the industry for about 16 years. Started off in environmental consulting. I've been working with WCSS for about the last 4 years now, and I held various roles. Right now, I'm the Zone 1 Alternative Chairman and the Area Q Chairman. For some reason, my Zoom's not recognizing my camera, but I guess you get a picture of me on the left there. So before I get into what I've learned from spill response, I just want to stress the important role that WCSS plays in our industry. without the webinars and the spill exercises they host, a lot of us wouldn't have the training or the access to the tools that are available to us through WCSS. So thank you. And then what I've learned in spill response is last year responding to an oil spill in a slough, all the oil was caught up in the vegetation. A lot of the guys were bent over trying to cut the vegetation off, breaking their backs. We found a better tool called a weed razor that has 2 blades. You throw it in the water, it's attached to a string, sinks to the bottom. As you pull it towards you, it cuts all the vegetation below the surface of the water and frees up all the oil and veg for recovery. So a real useful tool. And the Area Q equipment is located in Turner Valley and Waterton. They're both 24-foot ISRU trailers, and our closest regional equipment locations in Calgary.
Okay, carrying on with Walter.
Hi, I'm Walter Nassi. I work with Interpipeline, and I've been in the industry for about 19 years. Been with WCSS for 4 years, and just recently was, I don't know what you would call it, but I'm the Area S chairman now. So carrying on, things I've learned from spill response. I've taken all the spill responder courses offered by the WCSS, as well as jet boat and airboat training. And I have experience on small and larger spills. And of course, one of the most important things I've learned in the years that someone has to take control of the situation. Use your ICS. That is so important. You have to take control of the situation so that resources are used in a timely and proper manner. Training personnel through hands-on exercises is imperative to future success would a spill occur on your watch. The things we have in our Area S, in Lethbridge, we have a 20-foot initial response unit, CCAN, 2 work boats, and items stored in a shed can fit into the bed of a half-ton truck. 400 feet of shallow water boom, Turner Valley gates, 5 of those, 2,500 feet of snow fence, 2,500 feet of silt fence, 200 T-posts, 100-foot rolls of car lot flagging, and 25 rolls of holographic scare tape, and 2 bobblehead owls. Also in Brooks, we have a 24-foot initial response trailer and a 14-foot wildlife trailer. And in Medicine Hat, there's a 24-foot ISRU trailer.
Okay, Terry could not join us today, so I'm going to get Ryan Pearson to introduce both himself and Terry.
Hi there, Terry's in the field today. So Terry is the Area G chairman. He works with Ridgeback Resources. He's in the industry for about 15 years and with WCSS for 6. He was the alternate chairman and now and a steering committee member, but he's now moved up to the chair. He has taken all the spill response training, all the Med-A and handling courses, and basically got all the training that he needed. My name is Ryan Pearson. I'm the alternate chairman. I've been in the industry for about 25 years. I've started out with a REMREC coordinator for many of those years through many consulting companies. And then the last 9 years, I've been with Penn West / Obsidian as their spill coordinator. About 2.5 years have been with WCSS as the alternate chairman. So what I've learned over the years is just get big fast. It's easier to reduce, but it's really tough to catch up. The other thing is I really found it was really important was to keep communication with all of the internal folks and stakeholders versus BSing them, as it'll only cause you grief later on, and it just makes your life really hard as the lead of a spill cleanup. And that leads into this. You have to have somebody that takes the lead on all these spills. He can have as many layers below him, and but ultimately somebody has to make sure that they're running it, because it can really, the cost can get away from you, containment can get away if there's not some formal chain of command. So area G, we have the 20-foot skid-mounted sea can, which we have to haul with the winch trailer. It's out of Drayton, I believe at Hellhounds. And then the closest regional would be Atchison, which I believe Ryan and is going to talk about here in a little bit. So.
Thanks, Ryan. So on to Ryan Bauer.
Oh, I'm Ryan Bauer. I'm an electrician for Plains Midstream. Been in the industry for about 7 years. Been with WCSS for 4.5, going on 5. Since about 2014, I've dabbled in the emergency response and ICS kind of area, and I've been the chairman and alternate chairman for area IJ. And if anything, stay fresh. Attend these seminars, exercises. If you can, do any ICS training. The Spill Responder series with WCSS is great. WCSS is awesome that we can use all their tools, but if you don't know how to use them, then you're pretty much hooped. So
good afternoon, everybody. Mark Jones here. I represent the pipeline. Been in industry about 13 years. Been with WCSS about 10, as best I can remember. Been on steering committees, alternate chairman, chairman for Area P before, chairman for IJ. I'm on the executive subcommittee, and I'm also the alternate provincial chairman. What I've learned from spill response, you hear it a lot. Get big quick is a good idea, and it is. 100%. You want to get as many things on site as you can. You've heard that from a few folks already. The one thing though is make sure you can support everything you're bringing in and store it. You need a place to put it. You want to break a response quickly. That's the way to do it. You're going to choke morale, choke your access routes, angry stakeholders, increase health and safety risks, especially. And you really are balancing elephants on thimbles for the first days. You got to build a functioning community to deal with a larger spill, and if you don't, you're gonna just make your life a nightmare for sure. As for Area IJ regional equipment out of Atchison, we've got 3 airboats, twin engine barge with a bow skimmer, tow vessel, 52-foot Oscar sea can, 20-foot ISRU sea can, 40-foot boom cache sea can, 45-foot boom cache trailer, 16-foot winter Oscar trailer, inflatable lake boom reel trailer, and 400 feet of shallow water boom. We also have 2 boom vanes, shallow draft, 10 boom deflectors, 7 drum skimmers of power pack, circus skimmer and power pack, the air curtain incinerator is also at Atchison, and a 20-foot decontamination unit sea can.
All right, thanks, Mark.
Hi, my name is Darren Weimer. I'm your chairman for VR1. I've been working for CNRL for about 15 years. Been involved with WCSS for the last 9 to 10 years. I've held alternate chairman, and now I hold the chairman role.
Myself, Scott Nelson, I represent Plains Midstream, 15 years in the industry as well, and about 5 years on WCSS with the steering committee member and now current alternate chair. What I've learned, participate in WCSS exercises to ensure you remain familiar with the tools and equipment in the event they're needed. You can never be over prepared. We've heard lots of that. You know, if you got a chance to use the tools, learn how to use them before you actually need them. It makes it a lot easier. As far as the equipment here in VR1, some of it's located out of Lloydminster, some out of LaCorey. So in Lloyd, there's a 52-foot Oscar trailer, 2 work boats, drum skimmer with power pack, 40, believe that's lake boom, or is that it's a 40-foot sea can of lake boom, 40-foot heavy oil sea can, the heavy oil skimmer with power pack, and then in LaCorey there's a 20-foot ISRU sea can and 16-foot wildlife trailer.
Thank you, Scott. We'll just go into area Y. Go ahead, Morgan.
I am Morgan Alexander. I'm with Wolf Midstream. Been in the pipeline industry for about 20 years. Been involved with WCSS for about 5 or 6. Steering committee member, was the alternate chairman for Area Y, the current chairman for Area Y, and also the Zone 5 rep for the executive subcommittee currently. And what I've learned from spill response is don't underestimate the roles of planning and logistics in your emergency response. You need to take a step back, plan your response to keep everyone safe, minimize the impact of the event, minimize the adverse impact of the response, and effectively deploy resources. Charging into a situation without planning is going to make it more risky, more messy, more costly, and there will be unintended harm to the environment because you're rushing into it. Over to Kevin.
Yes, Area Y Chairman, or Alternate Chairman Kevin Mossage here. I represent Pembina Pipelines. Number of years working in the pipeline world is 32. Number of years committed to WCSS, 6 years. I was a steering committee member, alternate chairman, and a chairman actually. And what I've learned from spill response, I think learning different spill response techniques, WCSS is a great place for networking with other company reps and just working with other companies and seeing us, collaborate on the exercises. Area Y equipment. Fort McKay, we have a 45-foot Oscar Sea Can, workboat, deep draft boom vane, twin engine barge, 14-foot wildlife trailer, 40-foot boom cache Sea Can. The co-op in Conklin, we have a 20-foot incident initial response unit Sea Can there.
Okay, thank you very much, everybody. Hopefully that was good introduction for everyone. Again, when Amy gets a chance, she will post the link to that PowerPoint in the chat there. So while Holly prepares to share her screen and go through her presentation, I just want to review a little bit her bio. So she's entering her 7th year working with AWIC, and she's got extensive experience working with oiled wildlife, and she has presented for WCSS on a number of occasions, and I will say with a lot of confidence that she can probably answer any question that you have. She's a wealth of information. So Holly, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. I hope I can answer any question. I probably won't. So we'll see. You guys can test me today. So, but be kind. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Holly Lillie, and I am the Executive Director for Alberta Institute for Wildlife Conservation. We are located just northwest of Calgary, but we do respond province-wide. So I'm actually located just outside of Spruce Grove, actually just a few minutes away from the Atchison location where WCSS trailers are. So we do respond province-wide for animals that are in need. Today I'm going to be talking about oiled wildlife handling. There will be time for questions at the end, so please just use the chat function as Shannon described earlier, and we'll go through them once I'm done. So to start off, a little bit about AIWC, the organization that I am with. We were founded in 1993, and we are committed to the rescue, rehabilitation, and release of injured and orphaned wildlife. We are an accredited veterinary hospital, and we have X-ray and surgical facilities on site. Each year, the demand for our services increases, and last year, even in the midst of the pandemic, we admitted over 2,000 animals. So we saw a 30% increase in the number of animals brought to us last year. We reach thousands of people in the community, even with pivoting to providing online education, and over 6,600 calls were made to our wildlife hotline. It varies every year, but the majority of animals we see are birds. So this could be songbirds, such as robins, to raptors like owls and hawks, and to waterfowl, such as geese and ducks. We are a nonprofit organization. We're not funded by the government. No wildlife center in the province is, and we rely solely on private and corporate donations to operate. So the animals that we see every year, 95% of them are admitted to as a result of human conflict in some way. So examples would be window strikes, barbed wire, cat and dog attacks, and exposure to toxins. We are a permitted wildlife rehabilitation centre, and we are required every year to apply for federal and provincial permits to legally care for wildlife. Alberta is part of an enormous flyway system for migrating species, not only for wildlife, but for shorebirds, songbirds, and birds of prey. Alberta Environment and Park reports that the province is home to 587 species, and these include amphibians, mammals, birds, reptiles, and fish. The time of year and the location of a spill will really impact the species that you are likely to see. I've been at one spill where the most common species we dealt with was amphibians, and during the course of that spill, we trapped and relocated over 1,000 different species of frogs. We were monitoring, trapping, and relocating them, and every animal, no matter their size, really does play an important role to our environment and requires the same standard of care of any other. Another spill and the highest intake was of domestic feral geese. They had been owned once, but for some reason or another had been abandoned and now live free range in the area. Even though they weren't technically wildlife, they still required expert care to recover, and it was deemed that they were responsible to receive, they were under the responsibility of the party involved to receive care. Over 70 geese were rehabilitated and rehomed during that spill. In the areas you see, try and be proactive and become informed about the wildlife that call your location home. Plan ahead and have a wildlife protocol in place, and it will make your wildlife recovery much easier when needed. So at AIWC, we see about 2 to 5 cases of oiled animals each year, and this is outside of large spill events. So a large spill event would be hundreds of animals, but we haven't seen levels of that for quite some time in Alberta. The most common cause that we see at the moment for oiling or contamination we see is typically the sticky trap. So that's the lower bottom here. This is a wobbler stuck on a sticky trap. These traps are inhumane, and though they are, intended for mice, mice are often not the only victims. We're seeing several birds come in every year that are attracted to these because of the bugs on them, from woodpeckers to robins and warblers. So you really do need to be mindful of that. Animals can also become oil from any of the following examples. So we've got bitumen, diesel, motor oil left and covered in your yard or in your garage, oils from fish, cooking oil, grease outside a restaurant, etc. If an animal is oiled, they cannot survive on their own. They need human assistance to recover. If left untreated, they will certainly die, and they are not able to wash the oil off themselves. And every hour that they're oiled without supportive care, the chance that they recover is weaker and weaker. So how would you know if an animal is oiled? Ideally, shortly after the spill has been reported, a wildlife response team will be on site, and they will be responsible for the search and collection of animals in need. Until that time, and as I'm sure we all know, it does vary on the spill, you can monitor for wildlife being impacted by the spill and report any animals that are affected. Signs that an animal is oiled include seeing the oil on the fur or feathers. If a bird is oiled, when they are in the water, they start to sink. The water won't beat off their feathers, and they cannot thermoregulate on their own and quickly haul out of the water. And this is an example of a mallard up here. You can see that she's hunkered down. She's trying to fluff up to stay warm. You can obviously see there's a contaminant on her as well. So it's quite obvious that she's oiled and she's looking depressed. Often in a spill, the early morning is the best time of day to find impacted wildlife. They will have hauled out of the area, in the area when it became quiet, and they will be on land trying to stay warm. Oil contaminates the feathers of a bird, and depending on the oil, it can coat them in a dark, sticky substance, and this is quite obvious here with the mallard, but it can also be clear and harder to detect. Oil strips a bird or any animal of their waterproofing, and they need their waterproofing in order to properly regulate their body temperature. While it's not as often seen, mammals are also the victims of spills, depending on their location. On the bottom, we have a female beaver. She's an adult, and she's heavily oiled. Due to the contamination of her fur, she is not able to thermoregulate. And what this means is that she can't keep her body temperature where it needs to be. She can't regulate or control that, and she will not get clean on her own. She won't be spending very much time in water where she feels most comfortable, and she's going to get cold very fast. Sadly, not all animals will be found, but for each animal found, it makes a huge difference to that individual. They wouldn't survive without proper human intervention. It's important to note here that even if a dead animal is found, it is vital that they are collected so that they do not further contaminate the area, and other animals do not become contaminated if feeding on them. The wildlife response team will have a system for collecting and logging deceased animals. There are many ways that oil impacts animals. There are the obvious external effects, such as fur or feather damage, but then there are the not so obvious, such as general internal effects like organ damage and decreased fertility. There are also population changes to wildlife species that occur as a result of spills, especially the large spills. Often the question comes up if it's worth it to wash animals, if it's worth it to care for them. The thing is that when an animal comes oiled due to humans, whatever the reason, it is our responsibility to care for them. Research is constantly ongoing in this area, but studies have shown that animals have gone on to migrate and breed in the wild as normal, thus saving the life of even one animal worth it. In the case of a spill, if there are wildlife in the area, not only does a wildlife response team need to be on site to properly assess any impacted wildlife, they also need to haze any additional wildlife from coming into the area while the spill is cleaned up. Sherree's presentation will cover this, but a reminder that deterrence is needed and you have to change it up. It's very easy to put, all of the car flagging and ribbons and balloons and mylar and think, that's one job done. But animals can become oiled at any point during the spill, and you have to be proactive and set it up as soon as possible. And you need to maintain and change it. It can get damaged. It can also, the animals can get very accustomed to it very quickly. They're very smart and they can adapt. So even things like the sound cannon here, I would recommend moving this every couple of days because they get used to it very, very quickly. And you don't want them to get used to it because then they're going to be, getting more confident and start to explore the spill areas when there's less human activity. Health and safety considerations need to be taken with wildlife as well. There are many risks that you and your team need to be aware of. So depending on the spill, you may or may not be required or even permitted to handle any wildlife. This could be and often is covered by another unit of the spill response. However, some things to keep in mind. For PPE, always wear latex or nitrile gloves and never use your bare hands to collect oiled wildlife. Always wear safety goggles and use thicker gloves to handle birds of prey, such as owls and hawks, and for mammals. If you find an animal in need, the first thing to do is report it. Ideally, a wildlife response team will be in place and will have distributed their information so they can easily be reached. If you do not have a wildlife response team on site, ensure you have the authority to collect the animal and safely contain before responding. Report the animal as soon as you find it. I know in a spill, there's so many things going on and, it's hard to prioritize, something when there's, 10 things coming at you, but please don't put it off. I found this all too often that people forget to report animals and then that animal is moved, and animals will move. So, they're living things, they're going to move, and even deceased animals can inadvertently be moved during the process of a spill cleanup. So please don't put it off, report it, find out who is going to take care of it. And make sure that it's done properly, because that is the most frustrating thing from my end coming on a spill, is that animals, dead or alive, are not reported right away. And sometimes it takes days to get that news to the wildlife response team. And this is usually in the initial days of the spill. It does get better, but really do try and make sure that chain is always connected and that you're passing on the relevant information as it comes up. Depending on the species, federal and provincial permits are needed to capture wildlife. Planning ahead for what to do in the event of wildlife being impacted by a spill will ensure that time is not wasted on determining who is and isn't permitted to help when wildlife are found. So once you've received the necessary permissions to capture an impacted animal, you need to ensure that you're prepared before attempting to collect them. You need to have something to put the animal in, and you'll most likely only have one shot at capturing the animal. So you don't want to be struggling to confine the animal while you're trying to get a box ready. It just won't work. I'm not going to go over capture techniques, as you should have trained wildlife response staff on site. But if you do have specific questions, you can ask them at the end, but I also will provide my email at the end and you can reach out to me for more information. So if you're assigned to assist a wildlife team, which does happen sometimes in spills, you'll have the leads on the wildlife team and then others will be assigned to help them, then you'll be covered under their permits. Here's a quick breakdown of containing wildlife. So you want to get the container ready first. And if there is more than one animal you intend on capturing, have a container per animal. If you don't have enough containers on hand, you can use a larger one for 2 to 3 of the same species for a very short amount of time, and then transfer to individual containers later in the safety of an enclosed space so they don't escape. You want to be mindful of the size of the container, so the animal needs to be able to stand up and turn around. There needs to be some substrate in the box. Towels are ideal, but I know it's hard to come by and they do get wasted. They can't be used afterwards. So you can also use paper towels. And this just gives them some traction in the box, and it also provides some cushioning for them as well. Make sure the container has circulation. If you're using a cardboard box, use a pen or other item to put some air holes in it. And make sure that the air holes are not too large that the animal can escape of. Even, small birds, they will peck away at an opening to escape. They aren't used to seeing humans. They're not domesticated species. They're going to be very scared. So just be mindful of that. And then also make sure that you have a species appropriate for the animal too, or a container appropriate for the animal too. So this container is not going to work for a beaver or muskrat. They're going to chew out of that. So you may want to use a plastic crate or kennel instead. Once the animal has been captured, they will need to be safely transported to a secure location. This is often done by non-wildlife response staff, I found, as the wildlife staff are usually on site or at the recovery center, and then other individuals help with the transport. So stress is the biggest killer to wildlife in captivity. They aren't domesticated, as I've mentioned, and so they aren't reassured by our talking or handling, however much we try and convince ourselves that that's what they want. They really don't. At all times, the animal needs to be kept somewhere quiet and warm. When oiled, they can't properly thermoregulate, as I've mentioned, so they can't monitor and control their own body temperature. So what they do is they try and preen excessively and groom their feathers or groom their fur so that when they're cold, they think that, they can do that and they'll warm up, but it just doesn't work. So that's why you want to have a warm temperature so that they are less reliant on their own body heat and have supplementary heat. Ideally, the animal will be transferred to an on or off-site wildlife rehab center. So this is going to depend on the spill. There's some spills where there's a wildlife center right at the spill site, or a few kilometers away, or sometimes it's 100 kilometers away. It really depends on the individual spill. If the animal isn't being transferred to a center right away, you need to keep the animal somewhere warm, dark, and quiet and away from people until they can be moved. Don't give them food or water. I know that it's something that we think that they need, but it can actually do some more harm than good in some situations. And we do need to have a good examination of the animal first to make sure that they are healthy enough to withstand that food. So please don't give them any food or water, and do not try to clean them either. Await further instruction from wildlife personnel, and in the meantime, keep them in a low stress environment. In the instance of a spill, a chain of custody is followed and animals are tracked from their rescue all the way to their release. Ideally, they are admitted to a stabilization unit or wildlife center right away. And if this is the case, they will be transferred and left to rest for a period of time, usually 20 minutes before a full examination is done. The examination of any animals are performed by trained individuals, and this includes doing blood work, taking weight and temperature, removing oil from the eyes, nose, mouth, and feet. Fluids are given, and any other required medications. Evidence is taken in every animal, whether they are dead or alive, and this includes a photograph of the oiled animal and taking a feather or fur sample from them. This is the adult female beaver I showed earlier. She was collected from a spill site and housed in this crate overnight before being transported to Awicks Wildlife Hospital. If we had mentioned, like I mentioned, if we had put her in a cardboard box or even a plastic pet kennel, she would have chewed out of it in no time. So this was purchased before we attempted to capture. And again, just a reminder that you want to have the right equipment ready first. You will often only have one chance at capturing wildlife. They are very smart and they will elude you even further if you miss. So please be mindful of that. It will depend on the species, what type of container is better. With mammals especially, if you think they could chew out of it, even squirrels can chew out of plastic crates, then these metal ones are easier to go. But again, a squirrel could very easily fit through the bars of this, so you want to keep that in mind as well. In this situation, our vet was working, so that was fantastic because we had to sedate this beaver to do a full examination. And for any intake examination, we want to get an understanding of the animal's condition and make them more comfortable. This is not the time to go straight to washing the animal, and I'll talk more about the wash process coming up. So in the very first photo I showed you of this beaver, it didn't look as bad, or it may not have looked as bad, but looking closer and during the full examination, we found that she was 100% oiled. So what that meant is that there was no part of her body left uncontaminated. She was completely saturated. And we do use this as a measurement in the examination. If they're 20% oiled or 50% oiled, it gives us a good understanding of how healthy they may be and how soon they can go into the wash. So often with oiled wildlife, the first reaction is to want to wash them right away. And this is unfortunately one of the worst things that we can do. Animals need to be stable before they are washed. If a proper stabilization process is not followed, the animal will die during the wash or soon after it. We look at the wash process as a marathon, and you have to prepare for it. The animal's resources are depleted, they are stressed, weak, and vulnerable. Typically, animals are stabilized for 48 hours prior to considering a wash. This includes keeping them warm, providing them with food, fluids, and medical care. They are often susceptible to burns as a result of the oiling, and those need to be managed. Blood work is redone before the wash to ensure the animals are healthy enough to withstand the process. And all going well, they will be ready, but if they're not, then the wash will be delayed until the animal is strong enough to withstand it. So here's a Canada goose being tube-fed fluids. This tube is inserted into their mouth and reaches down to their stomach. And during the stabilization phase, fluids and often food, depending on the animal's condition, it has to be tube-fed to the animal every 1.5 hours from morning to night to get them strong enough for the wash. So this is a wash setup station at one spill site. Often the location of spills are remote and it's not feasible to always transfer the animals to a wildlife centre. So instead, a makeshift hospital is made with the goal of caring for wildlife impacted by the spill until they are ready to be released. So teams of trained personnel work to wash animals in a series of containers filled with a mixture of diluted soap, and the water is temperature controlled at 39 to 42 degrees Celsius. If the water isn't at the right temperature, the ingredients in the soap will not be activated and it will not work as well. So typically we have 3 people for the wash. One person will be responsible for washing the animal, one to hold and restrain, and the third to monitor the temperature of the water. The water is the hardest part during a wash. Depending on the setup, the temperature can fluctuate greatly. And it's really important for a wildlife response unit to have a sophisticated water system in place so the wash goes smoothly. Animals will crash very quickly if the temperature isn't controlled right and if we're waiting longer for warm water to come through. So it's really an integral part of the process. The wash process for one animal can take anywhere from 20 to 40 minutes, depending on the oil substance and the degree of oiling. All going well, the animal should only need to go through this process once. And then straight after the wash, the animal is moved to a rinse station. Properly rinsing an animal of any soap is just as essential as removing the oil from their feathers. The soap is a contaminant also, so we want to make sure we get all of that out. One person is responsible for rinsing the animal with a medium pressure hose, and one person is responsible for holding and restrained. If the animal is not properly rinsed, they will need to undergo another wash to remove any residue. And this process typically takes 20 to 30 minutes. So all going well, the wash process with rinse should take no more than an hour. Once the animal has been washed and rinsed, they are moved to a drying room to properly dry and start work and realigning their feathers or fur. And this will depend on the animal's size, the depth of their feathers, but it will usually take around 3 to 5 hours depending on the animal and their size. The final stage of the rehabilitation process is conditioning. This is when an animal is moved to a species-specific housing to finish up their recovery. So for waterfowl, they're moved into large pools of water where they can properly swim and they can preen their feathers and restore their waterproofing. Before a bird can be returned to the wild, they need to show excellent signs of waterproofing, be bright and alert, and have a good body condition. And then prior to their release, animals are banded for post-release monitoring. The cost to rehabilitated impacted animals will vary depending on the species, the spill, and the contaminant. For example, a healthy bird that has been oiled by motor oil that was left uncovered will probably cost a rehab center around $400 to $500. This includes staff time, food and medication for the animal, and the cost to dispose of the contaminated water. It doesn't include heat or water usage. According to the Oil Wildlife Response of BC, wildlife response is 1 to 5% of the cost of overall spill cleanup. The amount of water used to clean wildlife varies, again based on the species and the contaminant. International Bird Rescue states that one pelican uses as many as 300 gallons of water during the wash process. During one spill, they cleaned 700 birds and used 1 million gallons of water. Much of that was in the pools where the birds recovered after they had been cleaned. AWIC is the only facility in southern Alberta properly trained and equipped to care for oiled wildlife. We have specialized indoor and outdoor housing for water birds, the first facilities of their kind in Alberta. And we also help facilities in northern Alberta too, for example, Wild North with their oil wildlife response. Our capacity varies and is treated by a case-by-case basis. Every spill, as we all know, is different and it's hard to gauge, but the indicators we would use would be the type of oiling, the severity, the number of animals, and the species of the animals. It's very different to care for 10 loons than it is for 10 mallards, and that's because of their natural history, their care diet, and their overall care and things like that. So it's very different per species. We would also take into consideration the time of year. The summer is our busiest time and we can have anywhere from 200 to 300 animals in care every day. We do not have the resources to assist in a large spill at this time of year and would rely on outside support, such as international wildlife response groups to come in and help. When wildlife is impacted by an environmental event such as flooding, wildfires, or oil spills, receiving treatment within the first few hours is crucial. They require expert care from organizations with the right expertise, government permits, and previous experience. We were really fortunate to be sponsored by Interpipeline and the Government of Alberta through the Community Initiatives Program to build this wildlife emergency response trailer. It's the only one of its kind in Alberta and can be deployed throughout the province. This specialized unit provides mobile emergency assistance directly within or near the spill site. It allows us to assist wildlife that cannot be relocated immediately to a distant care facility. So during emergencies, one of the biggest challenges is to quickly get appropriate care for animals in need. AWIC is able to provide the mobile treatment facility and rehabilitation experience. These factors can make the difference between life and death for an animal in need. There's another angle there. So part of your emergency response plan in the event of a spill should cover how to manage wildlife. If this isn't already in place, take the time now to invest in this to help you in the long run. If you already have something in place, please review it at least every 2 to 3 years as things do change. As we saw earlier, Alberta is home to a large amount of species. It is likely that in a spill, some wildlife will be impacted. Try to have a few key pieces of equipment on hand in response unit. You don't have to have much, but even a pet net, pet carrier, towel, and heat pad or lamp will go a long way when you suddenly come across an animal in need. And lastly, connect with a wildlife rehabilitation center that has experience in odd wildlife and that can offer training and be a contact for you when it's needed. So here's a listing of wildlife rehabilitation centers in the province. You can take a screenshot of this if you need, and you can also email me too if you would like access to this too. So here's AWIC's information and my email. If you have any questions that weren't answered, please feel free to ask now in the chat, or feel free to email me too if you have any specifics. And any questions?
Thanks, Holly. I just wanted to point out actually a pretty interesting connection that Amy volunteers for AWIC, and it was a really great connection that we had. So sometimes you just don't even realize what sort of connections you have at your fingertips. So thank you so much, Holly, for that presentation. I'm really excited to see that response unit. I hadn't seen pictures of it, so I think that that's going to be a huge support in many ways. So you were saying that right now you couldn't handle more, is that right? You couldn't handle more oil wildlife at this point?
So it would depend in Alberta's history of oil wildlife response. No centre, so none of the nonprofits in the province have responded alone. So for example, Focus Wildlife or International Bird Rescue have come in to respond. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One, the wildlife centres here, we do not have oil spills often enough with wildlife impacted in large numbers to always be prepared. International Bird Rescue and Focus Wildlife, they respond worldwide, and they are often, even during the pandemic, going to spills. So they are staying up on the training, on the supplies, and they also have the resources too. So again, depending on the species, like if you were to ask me today, sure, we could take 5 mallards, we could probably take 5 loons, but normally spills happen in the summer, which coincides with our busy baby season too. So a company would probably, like Focus Wildlife, would come in and then they would subcontract to our organization, and we would supply them with staff, we would supply them with the trailer. I would probably go and respond to, as that's my background. I used to work for Focus Wildlife. So every situation is different, but we do have the means to care for oil wildlife at our facility. We would just need to bring in supplementary support as well. And that's one of the challenging things, is that often in a spill, you'll be sent, one animal at first, and then you're told, oh no, there's no more coming, but then 10 more come the next day. So that communication is a huge piece for us. It's very easy to just take 1 animal per day, but that adds up very quickly. It's much better for us to know from day one that, yeah, this could be hundreds of animals, so that we can get all of our ducks in a row and know how best we can respond. And then also, there's a lot of benefits to having companies like Focus come into. They are very aware of the, incident command centers and how to respond to that. They're HAZWOP are trained and things like that. And oiled wildlife is just one piece of what AIWC does, because we care for all oiled wildlife in need. So we do a huge variety of species. I think we're up to 160 species every year now, including bear cubs and moose calves and things like that. So the oiled wildlife is just one piece of it.
Wow, you guys are busy. I know that. You're busy all the time.
We are.
Yeah.
We did get one question on the chat. So can anyone handle and transport oiled wildlife? It's a good question. One I usually like to defer to the regulatory bodies. So my understanding is if you are covered under the permit of somebody else. So for example, AWIC's permits are in my name. So any volunteers of AWIC can respond under my jurisdiction, essentially. So if you are on a spill and there is a wildlife response team on site and you are covered under their permit, then yes, my understanding is that you can transport them. But again, every situation would be different. I would definitely want to verify that, but that's normally how it works. And typically in a spill situation, wildlife staff cannot, go and pick up animals from the spill site. Usually we're, relying on other individuals to do that, so that the people that are experienced in how to care for animals can stay, there doing that job.
Hi, Holly. I have a question for you. This is Jen Rogers speaking. Are you guys, when you get oiled animals, are you permitted to release them afterwards?
We are, yeah.
And is that like any species, as long as you get them to a satisfactory level, or allowed to be released?
Yeah, so we, and this would go for any animal, we will not release an animal back into the wild unless they are going to be, a thriving member of that wild population. So that goes for any animal that we admit. So the same with oiled wildlife. If they are going to be, a healthy member of the wildlife community, if they have the ability to breed and eat and migrate and things like that, then we will release them. There's nothing in the permits for any centre that we cannot release oiled wildlife once they've been contaminated, no.
It's interesting. Maybe I'll reach out to you afterwards. We ran into a situation where one of an animals that we had sent to, I think it was Wild North, was not allowed to be released. Like we were given guidance from the regulator that Wild North was not allowed to release it after it was rehabilitated. So we were just wondering if there's some inconsistencies across the province there.
Yeah, I would definitely reach out to me. Can you say what species it was?
It was a muskrat.
Oh, I mean, yeah, that is very unusual. There's no reason. I mean, the process for washing animals is that you wash them so that contaminant is removed. So I don't know what their argument was, but they shouldn't be able to argue that the animal would go in and contaminate the natural environment, because if you're doing the wash process properly, there will be no contaminant left on that animal. But definitely, yeah, I would be happy to chat offline too.
Great, thanks.
No worries, yeah. Any other questions?
I noted that you guys have a vet on staff, but not all rehabilitation centers do. Would you suggest that the success rate is different having a vet on staff?
Definitely. So at AWIC, we're fortunate that we do have a very high success rate. We have one of the highest in the country, and that's due to a number of things. So definitely veterinary care is one of them, and high standards of care overall too. We have consistency of care with our patients as well. So we are the only centre in the province that has a full-time vet. We've partnered with the National Wildlife Centre from the University of Guelph, and we have veterinary interns every year that come out, and then they are mentored by Dr. Sherree Cox, who is a fantastic leader of wildlife veterinary medicine in the country. So that's a huge component to our success. We can, stabilize fractures much sooner and get them into surgery. We can do more extensive diagnostics and things too. So that definitely plays a huge role in the success of our patients.
That's good. Yeah, so not everybody has that. That's important to know. I did note the grouping of where all those centers were, and some of the folks who are joining us today are actually closer to the Saskatchewan border or more north. So I just wondered if you happen to know of any rehab centers that are in Saskatchewan, maybe closer to that border?
There is, so in Saskatchewan, there's Prairie Wildlife out of Saskatoon, and there's also the University of Saskatchewan. The vet school there has a wildlife center attached to it as well. So those would be really good resources that I would definitely reach out, especially the vet school. They have a great program there. So that would be one contact. However, in a spill situation, to my knowledge, at least in Saskatchewan, there isn't a rehab center that is capable of handling a spill. So what they've done in the past, the most recent one, I think was a couple of years ago, is Focus Wildlife came into that one. And I think they had something like 70 beavers or something, which is a huge amount. So they did a specific site set up for that, where they were responding remotely. And I think they utilized CCANs and things like that to care for them specifically. So it really does depend on the area, and there's definitely a gap for wildlife rehab north of Edmonton too. So there is no wildlife center north of Edmonton. So anything, in the Fort McMurray area or anywhere really, is typically flown down to either Wild North or AIWC. And again, it depends on the species. So if it's a bear cub, which unlikely, touch wood that we would have an oiled bear cub in this situation. But if it was a bear cub or a moose calf, typically AIWC will respond province wide for those, and I would just go and get those guys because it's closer to me where I'm based. But typically they would be flown by the company to one of the centers at that point.
Interesting. Thank you. Thank you for that information. I'm not seeing any questions. Are you getting any in your chat?
No, I don't think so. Yeah, if anyone has questions, feel free to pop them in. Otherwise, I think, yeah. Okay.
I just had one more question. You mentioned making sure that you move the wildlife to a low stress environment. And I know each spill is different, but can you give an idea of about how far away from that operational zone people should be looking towards to give that low stress environment?
I mean, even, it sounds simple, but I mean, it makes a huge difference. Even like a bathroom in a trailer or something, just lock it, put a sign on, don't enter. If there's offices in the trailer, just try and be mindful that, you don't need to be talking loudly, and just, minimize talking where possible, but really just a room where they are by themselves, turn the lights off, make sure that there's a good temperature in there. And, you can check maybe the first hour to make sure they're fine, but otherwise don't peek at them. Like it just elevates their stress levels. And at that point, really, I mean, if they are crashing, you're not going to have the ability to do anything anyway. So I think it's just better to just leave them at that point. And yeah, just so a bathroom, an office space, the end of a trailer or something can shut it up, or in a car too. I mean, obviously then you would need to keep your car running, but it would depend on the weather too. If that was possible, you also don't want them to overheat either. So that is something to keep in mind, but it really can be very accessible, in a bathroom or an office, and just put a sign on there that no one else can go in. So.
Thank you. That's really helpful. I never even thought about that before. So thanks for that.
That's where I put mine. So yeah, in the bathroom. So
yeah. Okay. Well, yeah, once again,
Thank
if you guys do have any questions, I think Holly, you'll be able to stick with us for the rest of the webinar. So feel free to send her any questions directly if you'd like.
Perfect. Oh, sorry, just one question. Yeah, transport immediately or stabilize first. It depends on how quickly you can transport and how far away the final destination is. So stabilization takes quite a while. So for example, if let's say the spill was in Fort McKay or something like that, and you knew that you wanted to take those patients to Edmonton, I would probably just make the trip to Edmonton right away and start the stabilization there. If you knew that you were going to keep them in that area of the spill, so using a trailer and warehouse combinations, then you would transport to there and then start stabilization. If for whatever reason you can't transport for a day or two, then you could start stabilization at the spill site or like wildlife unit then. But ideally we want to get those animals to their final spot as soon as possible. So if the wildlife trailer is up there, so ours or a similar one is up there, we could do some stabilization. And what that would include would be fluids, but we'd also just do an examination and like make sure that the animal can travel too. So we want to triage them at that point. So that's the benefit of having the trailers, that we can triage. We don't want to be transferring animals for several hours if we know that they have a wing fracture that isn't going to be repairable, or if they have substantial damage somewhere else that just isn't going to be repairable aside from the oiling. So it would be case by case at that situation, but that is the benefit of doing some triage if you have wildlife personnel on site. And this would be wildlife rehabilitators. So this would be people that know what they're looking for, and then they know how to properly euthanize if that animal is triaged out as well. So I hope that answers your question, but if not, feel free to pop more in there. Okay, perfect.
Holly, there's one more. What is an acceptable room temperature for stabilization for birds and small animals?
That's a good question. So 23 to 25 is good. We like that amount. We try and keep that amount when we're working for oiled wildlife at our facility. So we try and keep it at that amount and then monitor them too. So if they are in their container and they are open mouth breathing and they're panting heavily, then we know that it's too warm, and then we'll adjust as needed. But typically 23 to 25 is a good temperature to kind of get them warm enough that they feel like they don't have to do that excessive preening and things like that.
There's one question here. Wildlife handling permits criteria, is it only for professional licensed biologists, or for the staff trained that are capable and competent working under the direction of a professional licensed biologist on the handling permit, or other who can get the permit, in other words?
It depends on the type of permit. So my familiarity is more with the federal and provincial wildlife rehabilitation permits. Sherree will know more about the damage handling and things like that. So with my experiences, the permit is in an individual's name. So at AIWC, the permits are in my name as an individual, and then anybody that I list under that is covered under the permit. So that's either the federal permit, which covers migratory birds except raptors, interestingly. They do not cover raptors in the migratory birds permit. And then Alberta permit covers everything. So if people are listed under my name, then they can respond and they can capture and transport those animals. So typically in a spill, like the most recent one I was at, I was there for a few days, and then I gave permission for the wildlife biologists on site to work and respond underneath my permit. We have processes set up. I felt confident with their abilities. They kept me in communication. So those situations are case by case. To have a wildlife rehab permit, you would not get those as a company. There's far too much training involved, and they are typically not in the process or in the habit of giving those out to regular companies. You would have to be a fully fledged wildlife rehab center for that, and to my knowledge, they haven't given out permits for quite a few years. I think they are looking at the process, and I think they want individuals to do internships and things like that and have X amount of hours under their belt until they get permits. So if you can connect with wildlife biologists now, if you haven't already, that at least have some of the permits needed to capture those animals, then the rehab portion is always going to be covered by another center that wouldn't be covered by wildlife biologists necessarily, unless they are wildlife biologists and a wildlife rehabber. But at least then you could get those animals handled on site and transferred to where they needed to go. I hope that answered your question. If not, definitely feel free to say in the chat or mute yourself too, that's fine. Any other questions?
I love that I can hear those baby chicks.
Oh, you can see the baby chicks if you want. They're very awake now.
I think it's just so fitting that that this happened today.
I know, and they're like pets. These are not wildlife. These are more chickens I'm adding in math. So yeah.
I love it. I love it. I have a question for you specifically. I know on occasion, Holly, you will be deployed to a spill. So when you arrive at a spill site, what is it that you are looking for specifically?
I think it depends. So ideally, if AWIC is deployed to a spill site, our job is not to do the wildlife assessments. Our job is to take care of the wildlife that are impacted. So my the best situations I've had on spills is where they've had wildlife biologists doing the sweeps and the assessments, and then they report any findings to the wildlife team, and the wildlife team are there to capture any animals that are needed and then to do the care. That would be the ideal situation, is that you have the two divisions, because I'm not up to date on everything that Sherree is. My background isn't as a wildlife biologist, it's as a wildlife rehabilitator, and there are different standards for each. So I think, yeah, having those two divisions really does help, so that you are off on a strong foot. And especially with the big spills, you're going to need multiple people for those situations. So in a big spill, obviously there's a lot more to this, but typically you have the wildlife biologists that are doing the sweeps and the assessments. Then you have the search and collection team. These are dedicated people that are going out into targeted areas to find the animals. And then you have a rehab team that may not even be on the spill site. These could be 5 minutes away or 10 minutes away in a warehouse or in a wildlife center. And the rehab team just show up every day to care for the wildlife. They may never even see the spill. So that is my preferred method of doing things, so that we're not trying to do search and collection while also keep animals on the timings with their fluids and things like that. Like I mentioned in the presentation, typically animals that are oiled, we've got them on tubing schedules of every hour and a half. And that's a lot to manage, even if it's one animal, but when you multiply that by 10 or 20 or 600, which is the case, or even more with some of these big spills, it's just not feasible. So you do have to have that separate divisions that work in tandem for overall success.
That's really helpful. Yeah, that makes me think more back to Mark's earlier comments about really you need to support a community when you've got a spill response. So you're very much an element of that community. Your response unit, I really love. Are there plans to build another one?
There are not. So our plan with this, we have deployed it a couple of times. Our plan is to have it available to deploy as needed. And we also use it for quarantine or for overflow of patients as well. And then also for specialized cases. So it's with me in Northern Alberta if we get bear cubs, which we do every year now, and they're typically from Northern Alberta, then they will be stabilized in that unit for the night before they go to our center in Calgary. So it's dual purpose so that it's always used. And then ultimately, when COVID is over, we would like to do trainings and things out of there too. So and we would also allow other companies to use it too. So Focus Wildlife or International Bird Rescue, we would have an agreement. Ideally, that's what we're in the planning stages of now, that if there was a spill that was 10 animals and they responded to it themselves and they didn't need any assistance, and then they could take our trailer because it's a lot. Focus does actually, but typically the international oiled wildlife response groups, they don't have equipment stationed everywhere. So this would be a resource in Alberta that they could tap into.
That's one thing I really appreciate about AIWC is your ability just to maneuver so quickly.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, it's impressive. I don't know, are there any other questions in your chat, or Amy, did you get any questions?
No.
Okay, awesome. Oh. No, I think we're good. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thanks again, Holly. I hope you'll be able to stay on for the rest of the webinar in case anyone has any follow-up questions. So I'll let you rest and check on your baby chicks. And just while Sherree is sharing her screen and her video, I will just do a brief little intro for her. You guys would have seen in the bio that she's got a very rich background in environmental science and environmental management. And the fact, I was saying yesterday, the fact that she holds 2 patents for low impact spill remediation technologies is just so impressive to me. I love that. And I hope that Toonces, your cat, has her own laptop to use again today.
I don't know where she is. She might come in howling like she normally does when I'm working, but hopefully not, because it's very loud and very annoying. So anyway, thank you guys for joining us today. And as both Shannon and Holly mentioned, if you have questions after, feel free to ask them either via the chat function or just unmute yourself and ask away. If I don't know the answer, I will do my best to find out for you. So I'm going to talk to you guys about what you can do with and without authorization in regards to wildlife response and mitigation on spills. So one of the most important things that I've learned in emergency response is that no part of a response should hinder another. In this case, it's vitally important that wildlife work hand in hand with operations to ensure timely response and to keep the footprint as small and manageable as possible. In the long run, this type of unified action is better for all aspects of the cleanup and the overall recovery of the ecosystem. During the initial phase of a response, a wildlife management plan is generally required to be submitted to the regulators. The wildlife management plan outlines the type of wildlife and habitat that may be impacted by the spilled fluids and your plans to mitigate the impacts. The plans should contain information from the Alberta Fish and Wildlife Management Information System. This database will give you a good idea of what types of animals and fish are in your area, if you're in a fish-bearing watercourse, and if you're in special wildlife management areas. Even if you're not the person responsible for creating a wildlife management plan, it's a good idea to familiarize yourself with this database. The more information you have going into a spill, the more prepared and successful you'll be at managing wildlife. So what activities can you do without a permit? Up here, you'll see on the screen, you can install wildlife fencing, deterrents, attractants, and do some hazing depending on restricted activity periods. One of your main objectives should be to prevent the spread of contaminants and to protect the environment. You don't want to increase your footprint because you're waiting on approvals. Without a permit, you can start your wildlife fencing, install deterrents, add attractants to unimpacted areas, and even do some minor hazing. On the flip side of that, you should also immediately call your local fish and wildlife representative and let them know that you're working on a spill and that you plan to mitigate impacts to wildlife with fencing and deterrents. There's really no right or wrong answer to where or how many deterrents you should install. The beauty of wildlife mitigation is that it's an ever-changing plan. In fact, if your deterrents aren't moving, they aren't likely scaring wildlife away anyway. You may have to adjust your fence and deterrents and your hazing techniques once your wildlife biologist has had an opportunity to look at the site, but the important thing is always that you start. At this point, you should also have looked at your SDS. In fact, one of the first things you should do on any spill is look at the SDS. It's vital to protecting yourself and to planning for your spill. Once you've determined what you're dealing with, you can build a plan based on the contaminants in the environment. You may also have to collect some background information for your location. And to do this, you just conduct an initial reconnaissance to determine what you're dealing with. Some of the information that I like to go into a spill, and it's great when operators provide it to us, is, how big, where is it? Have you seen any wildlife just in the area, and what have you seen? If you've seen any impacted wildlife, also let us know that. When you're doing assessment, you can build some of these questions into your planning further down the road for your wildlife mitigation plan. So you want to know what and where the contaminants are, how and where the contaminants are moving, what is the habitat type that's been affected, and which species are at risk of impacts from the spill. Your wildlife management plan, although you can have a canned version, definitely needs to be specific to the spill that you're working on. Also be mindful of the fact that different contaminants move differently in different environments. For example, we often deal with oil emulsion and produced water spills in Alberta. Large majority of the fluids that are spilled might be produced water. Produced water moves a little bit differently in the water than does oil, but also can affect different types of habitats differently. For example, with produced water, most of the impacts are going to be sitting below surface, where some of the wildlife don't have access to anyway, or most wildlife, if it's in something like a bog or a fen. If you're working in a watercourse, then oil might be the contaminant of concern that you're going to be really focused on dealing with, because the produced water is generally, unfortunately, mostly gone by the time we get there. So wildlife fencing. This is something that you can start immediately upon arriving at your spill site. Wildlife fencing, there's a couple of tricks to installing a fence, but the most important things to remember with wildlife fencing is that it doesn't provide a physical barrier. It provides a visual barrier to wildlife. I always tell people that wildlife are lazy just like us. If they can't see the end of your fence, they're going to go right through your fence. So one of the things to do is take a look down the visual line of your wildlife fencing. And if you can't see the end of it, create visual jogs in your fence line. Make sure that your fence is at least 6 feet high, that it's tight, and that you don't have any openings. You can create man gates where you need them, that's fine. But again, make sure you've got those visual breaks. If you're working during seasons where amphibians are active, which is every season but winter really, you need to key in a silt fence 10 centimeters into the ground along the bottom. Panel fencing and snow fencing work as well. Something else to mention about wildlife fencing is that it's important to keep your wildlife fencing around the area of impact that wildlife have access to. So what I mean by that is if you've got oil on the ground just at your break point, that's the area that you want to fence off. The more wildlife fencing you have, the more wildlife fence you have to maintain. And that's fine, except for you need to be mindful of creating flow paths. So try to keep it around the area of impact that wildlife have access to. Something else to keep in mind is that you're pounding T-posts into the ground, so always do an emergency 1 call. So up here, this is normally where I would ask you guys what you see that you like about these pictures and what you see that looks kind of suspect. What would you change? Because we're not going to be that interactive right now, I'll just go through some of the pros and cons of what you see here. So in the first picture, see that we've got amphibian fencing and we've got the height. So this fence looks like it's probably 6 feet high. Probably, if it was taut, it would be a little bit more visually intimidating for wildlife and would have better results at mitigating wildlife moving through your area. I don't know how long any of these fences are, or you can't see them in the picture, but again, make sure to create visual breaks. Also with wildlife fencing, you can use your wildlife fencing to move wildlife through an area or to an area that you want them to go through. So if you can get them to follow the fence line out of your area, that is very helpful too. In the center picture, you can see that it looks like it might not be high enough, but if it is, that's fantastic. But on the bottom, the silt fence is not keyed into the ground. So you definitely want to make sure that you key that silt fence in so that amphibians and small mammals can't move under it. And the last picture, we have no need for amphibian fencing because it's in the middle of winter, but we definitely have a pretty sad looking wildlife fence. Definitely could be a little bit more visually intimidating. If you guys are having problems getting that 6 foot height, that's not an issue. Oftentimes we don't have enough T-posts or snow fence to kind of make it that 6 foot height all the way around. That's okay. Take some just yellow rope and tie a rope at the 6 foot height and then tie flags along the top of it. And that works like a charm too. You can also put things like wavy man. Probably don't want to put that on the top of your fence, but things like your scary eyes and mylar tape as well. So here you can see some different types of deterrents. Before installing any deterrents, there's some things that you need to consider. Some species are difficult to deter, and deterrents that mimic sound or visual elements that they're used to seeing will make it hard to get rid of them. Hazing and other forms of human activity may serve or maybe adverse. It may have adverse effects to some wildlife that are sensitive in some sensitive areas. Seasons will affect migration and breeding. The types of breeding birds that are also in the areas are going to determine which types of deterrents will be most effective for you. Also, something to be aware of is the contaminant plume predictions. You want to avoid dispersing wildlife into areas that may become impacted. Also, one thing too to keep in mind is that you don't want to hold up a spill response and risk increasing the size of the overall spill footprint for one element of a response. Wildlife mitigation, again, must work closely with operations to execute a timely and efficient response that's best for the overall health of the ecosystem. So here's a bunch of different types of deterrents that work for different types of animals. For amphibians, there's not really any type of chemical or visual deterrent that work to keep them out of an area for spill. In this case, we depend on physical barriers like amphibian fencing to be put in place. For mammals, you can deter them visually, physically, or with acoustics, and that helps to make the spill less appealing. Deterrents include, but are not limited to, human effigies, coyote effigies, mylar flash tape, pie plates, zon guns, and snow fence for your wildlife fencing. All of these things listed on this sheet or on this slide are available in the WCSS trailers. For birds, visual and acoustic deterrents are used to make the spill less appealing. Physical barriers are difficult to put in place because birds are able to fly over them. However, if you install because of the angle that birds try to land at a 30-degree angle, if you set up flagging tape or Carlot flagging, pennant flagging, whatever you want to call it, across your water body at 10-meter increments, it makes it physically difficult for them to actually land on the surface. So that's something to keep in mind. Other things that work great for deterring birds are predatory bird effigies, coyote effigies, human effigies, windsocks, predatory bird kites, pennant flagging, mylar and scare tape again, scary eyes, and zon guns or the bird guards. We'll talk about the bird guard a little bit later on, but don't set up audio deterrents near residents or roadways where it can be hazardous. It's just something to keep in mind. So here you can see a couple of different examples of effigies that you have access to via the WCSS wildlife trailers. There's a bird of prey, the wavy man, the scary eyes, and of course the infamous scarecrows. Auditory deterrents can be a great tool to use. I don't get to show you how the bird guard works this year, but it's basically a system that plays various birds of prey sounds at intervals that you select. If you choose to use the bird guard, make sure that you know the species that are in your area and what sounds you're playing. Some of them may attract other wildlife to your site, like scavengers or territorial birds. Additionally, things like air horns, zon cannons, equipment noise, and yelling work very well to deter wildlife from your site. We already discussed wildlife fencing, but physical barriers can include anything like fencing, even what I mentioned earlier, setting ropes at 30 or 10-meter intervals across a water body to prevent birds from landing. Works great for preventing birds from physically entering your spill area. Something else that we use for longer term wildlife management is things like netting, and netting's pretty popular on long-term projects as well. Actually, I'm just going to go back to physical barriers. One thing that we don't really often think about that on water spills we should be considering is how we're going to prevent fish from moving in and out of contaminated areas. And we set up what we call block nets, and realistically it's screen that works really well across the area. To basically, you want to isolate the area where the contaminants are entering, so your point of entry. So visual deterrents include things like mylar tape, pie plates, Carlot flagging, and flagging tape. Some of these things are really work better for certain species, and actually can be attractants for others. Like magpies, for example, really like things that are shiny. Same with crows. One thing that I found that works really well is to take 2 pie plates, tape them together or staple them together, put a rock in them, and that seems to produce just enough noise and flash that it's pretty good at deterring almost all species that we have here. So hazing is an aggressive technique to scare wildlife. You can use auditory or physical methods. Anything loud will generally scare away most wildlife, especially if they're not used to people. Wildlife that have adapted to human activity are going to be harder to scare with sounds, so you may need to take physical measures. This can include things like chasing and throwing sticks. Ensure that when you use physical techniques to scare wildlife, you do so in a safe manner. Work safely. Worker safety is our #1 priority. So make sure that if it's an aggressive species, use common sense and make sure that you have safety procedures in place. Additionally, you don't want to hurt wildlife when hazing them. Don't throw items at them. You can throw things near them. You always say like a 1 meter buffer, but don't throw anything directly at them. Also be mindful of the fact that you can't actively haze if it's during a restricted activity period. So if you're trying to chase some birds out of the area, for example, and it's during the restricted activity period, you're going to need permits to do active hazing. So something that we've been talking about the last couple of years is attractants and the use of attractants in spill response. Attractants are kind of new to the game. We don't always have the opportunity to use them. However, we know that wildlife get used to our deterrents, and we also know that wildlife have been displaced from the spill response. So wildlife mitigation solely through deterrence may not always be effective, which is why we've been using attractants as well. So consider making a similar or nearby habitat attracted to wildlife displaced from a spill. You can do this by using decoys or lures, or even by restricting activities in that area. In some cases, you may want to consider moving your staging area to maintain high quality habitat where displaced animals and wildlife may need to go. Keep these areas clean and quiet. You may also consider attractants such as scent lures, decoys, or wildlife calls if you're trying to attract a specific species to an area. For example, we bait beaver traps with castor. With the permission of Fish and Wildlife, you may also be able to use scent lures or other means of attractants in a specific area. One of the most important and often overlooked things on a spill is keeping your site clean from a multitude of perspectives. It's fundamental that you keep your site clean. You don't want to attract wildlife to your site, so make sure that your garbage and decon areas are clean at the end of the day. And even though you might think things like bananas or orange peels are biodegradable, they attract wildlife, so clean up after yourselves. Don't create nuisance animals. The easiest and most effective way to control wildlife on your site is definitely by keeping it clean. So those are all the activities that you guys can start with right away during a spill that you don't need permits for, but what activities do you need to have a permit for? Things like trapping, hazing inside restricted activity periods, capture, removing dams or lodges, handling oiled wildlife, transporting wildlife, fish salvage, and other in-stream activities all require permits. So this is a quick overview of some of the permits that we're required to have on when we're going into a spill site. To ensure that the Wildlife Act is regulated and that wildlife is protected, wildlife research permits and collection licenses are needed to handle, capture, and transport wildlife. The application can be found on the AEP website under Wildlife Management section. During the application process, ensure that Protocol 003 for amphibian handling and capture and Protocol 007, which is small mammal capture and handling, are included when filling out your application. The applications can take a long time, so I suggest calling your local Fish and Wildlife department or officer to obtain approval a little bit more quickly. Damage control licenses are needed if your work will destroy beaver dams or muskrat dens. Licenses give permission to capture, handle, and transport beavers and muskrats. There's no formal application form. The area fish and wildlife biologists we usually send them an email and they're with our request outlining what we're planning on doing, the severity of the situation, and how many dams or individuals might be impacted by the spill. And then they send you back a verbal or written approval. Any spill that's in a fish-bearing watercourse should have an associated fish research license, even if you're not doing any fisheries work. It's important to have one in place in case you find dead fish. Those usually need to be collected. The application, again, can be found on the AEP website under the Fisheries Management tab. In addition to provincial applications, you might also need to obtain some federal permits. These can include things like permits under the Federal Migratory Birds Act, the Species at Risk Act, and the Fisheries Act. Trapping wildlife is something that you definitely need to have a permit to do and should only be done by trained individuals. Trapping wildlife falls under the Wildlife Act. The Alberta Wildlife Management Branch observes Protocol 003 and 007 for trapping small mammals. And again, these protocols must be listed in your wildlife management plan and on your permit requests. Damage control permits are also required before you can trap beavers and muskrats. So check all your traps in accordance to the best management practices for that type of species. And one thing that you can do right away that actually doesn't require a permit is for you to call the Alberta Trappers Association and see if you can get some trappers who can help you. The trappers are usually a wealth of knowledge of what's in the area and can help you remove some of the species immediately. So pitfall traps are usually specific to amphibians, at least on spills. We follow AEP class 003 again for amphibian handling when we're installing pitfall traps. One thing to remember is that you can't just set these and leave them. You need to check them regularly. Don't leave them set for more than 48 hours without checking them, and cover the traps when they're not in use. Pitfall traps are pretty easy to install. They basically consist of a pail that's dug into the ground so it's flush with the surface. Put some water or a sponge that's wet into the pail. And then we put a stick in some sort of, basically, you're just creating a little microhabitat, giving them different places to go in the pail. If you're suspecting a lot of rain or it's really hot, sometimes we'll put covers over the traps as well. Again, remember to make sure to cover the traps when they're not in use and check them regularly. Live traps, Holly kind of went over some of that, like how they remove oiled wildlife. We definitely use live traps on a regular basis. This live trapping can only be done by permits by experienced people. It's essential that you wear proper PPE and that you take precautions to protect yourself at all times. We are, trained to know what wildlife could potentially be in the area and what's applicable or what's the most appropriately sized and type of trap for the situation. So Holly told you all about how they deal with oiled wildlife. Engaging trained people to deal with oiled wildlife keeps you safe and gives you and the animal the best chance of survival. Not that you're fighting for survival, but you definitely don't want to get hurt by them either. If you encounter oiled wildlife, do not touch it. Keep calm. Don't chase it or try to keep it in a specific area. Just let it do its thing. Keep an eye on it until an experienced handler arrives. Vitally important not to stress them out. What happens if you find dead wildlife? Well, wildlife mortalities are required to be tracked and documented daily as a requirement of your permits and the Wildlife Act. Information pertaining to how you collect, document, and track dead wildlife will also be required to be part of your wildlife management plan. Wildlife biologists generally submit this information to the applicable regulator on time schedules that the regulators ask us. One thing to keep in mind is that the appropriate documentation must accompany the animal at all times. Always document and always keep good field notes. Some of you guys have heard me say this before, and I'm sure many of you will hear me say it again. If you think it's important, write it down. If you don't think it's important, write it down. And that goes for anything across your spill. Document, document, document. Always keep good field notes. Only individuals listed under the permit can actually touch wildlife, including deceased wildlife. Improper handling of dead wildlife outside of the terms of your permit is considered a contravention of the Alberta Wildlife Act. So what do you do if you find deceased wildlife in or around your spill area? Take a picture of it, GPS the location that the animal is found at, then using latex or nitrile gloves, wrap the deceased animal in tin foil, place the tin foil in a paper bag, place the paper bag into a Ziploc bag, and then on your Ziploc bag, you want to write the chain of custody number, the species, if you know what it is, if it was impacted by spilled fluids, the date and time, the UTMs, the name of the spill, and the name of the person that collected the specimen. Also provide the contact information if you can. Then you'll complete your wildlife chain of custody form. Again, that must accompany the animal at all times. Put the plastic bag in the freezer until the animal can be transferred to the Fish and Wildlife office. Contact AEP to inform them of the dead animal. If it's something small like frogs, we usually do this on a weekly basis. For larger animals, we contact AEP immediately. So transporting wildlife, Holly kind of went through this already, so I won't go through too much of this. Again, you need to be on the permits in order to transport wildlife anyway. So if it's something that you're really interested in, feel free to ask some questions after the presentation. You want to limit the stress to an animal, so transfer the captured animal in the appropriately sized crate. You want to make sure that it's not so big that they do a lot of moving around, but you definitely want to make sure that they have enough room to be comfortable as well. Make sure that the individual does not get hypothermia, so keep your vehicle's heat on ideally, or keep the temperature between, Holly said already, 23 and 25 degrees Celsius, I think it was. Ideally, you want to limit stimuli too, so we cover the crates, and I know you might want to listen to music or your podcasts on the way there, but try to keep it as quiet as possible. Limit your interaction, as in there's not really a reason why you should be interacting with the beaver that you're transporting anyway, so just leave them alone. If you're suspecting that it's going to take a long time to get there, you might want to check on them every once in a while, but make sure that you just try to avoid interactions with them. Okay, so just to recap all of that, ensure that all permits are in place as soon as possible. Usually verbal for an emergency response is sufficient. Start setting up your deterrence and fencing as soon as possible. Again, don't forget that there's no right or wrong answer with deterrence. They're movable, and if they're not moving, they're not working, so it's okay. You can do anything you want with those. Fences, if you're going to set one up, need to be tight around the surface of impacts that are the impacts that wildlife have access to. Make sure that your fencing is practical because you need to maintain it and you don't want to create flow paths. Consider making a nearby area attractive to wildlife. Base your wildlife management plan on the contaminants and species that are in the area. Your wildlife management plan, like your wildlife mitigation on a spill site in general, is not static. It depends on the environment, the contaminants, and the time of year, and it's an ever-changing document. And something to consider is get a qualified professional to site as soon as you can to start capturing and collecting oiled wildlife. Does anybody have any questions?
There's a couple in the chat. One, does a minnow classify as a fish?
Yes. According to DFO, it does classify as a fish. The Fish and Wildlife Management Information System that I mentioned earlier, that's Alberta inventory of basically fish and wildlife that have been surveyed in areas across the province. When you apply for a fish research license or when you're doing wildlife work, that information actually has to get uploaded. It's one of the stipulations of your permits, so that populates the database. So it's a really good place to start when you're looking for information about what species could be present in your area. I know we think like something like a stickleback, for example. I call them like the duct tape fish because you kind of find them everywhere. They're just sort of like I've found them doing fish surveys in ditches up by Fort McMurray. Like, it's crazy. You'll find them everywhere. But again, that's kind of one of the benefits of having a wildlife biologist on site, is that, maybe that's the only species you have, or it's not high quality habitat. If it has potential, your spill, to affect downstream habitat or downstream fish, then it might be a different story, but they can definitely help direct you towards the best plan for your site.
And another one, can you transport multiple animals or species at the same time in a vehicle?
We have, in a pinch, if necessary. It's usually if we have multiple animals at one time, I don't like doing that, but we do if we have to. Just make sure that you cover their crates. Yeah. And I know it's tempting to throw them in the box of your truck, because they're, you have a nice vehicle and you don't want a stinky beaver in the back of there, but you got to not do that. Keep them in the cab of the vehicle.
So Sherree, yesterday we also talked about something that I think is worthwhile repeating. Can you clarify where wildlife fits into the ICS structure?
Yeah. One of the things I'm a huge advocate for is right out of the gate integrating your wildlife management unit, whatever you want to call it, into your ICS structure. Normally, we kind of fall under that planning section, but we also work really closely with operations as well. So that kind of would be dependent upon where your ICS team thinks that you're going to best fit. But I do encourage all of you to, when you're setting up your ICS, don't overlook wildlife management as something that needs to be in there, because it's going to be something that you're going to do from the very start of your spill, the very first day, to the very last day that you're out there. So
awesome, thank you. I also would like to remind everybody that if you haven't downloaded the app, or if you have, you can get access to the Fish and Wildlife numbers directly on the notifications page. It's located under additional contacts. So go ahead, download that app, get to know it. Lots of useful information in there. Thanks, Sherree. Actually, I'm just going to ask George if you have anything that you would like to share with the group. George is coming in from AER.
No, actually, Shannon, you guys did another great job. I've been to quite a few of the wildlife shows. I'm impressed with the attendance and the numbers. That's great. I know the AER in COVID has been pushing any type of virtual engagement that the industry can get. So this is just an example that everyone's buying in, and the AER is definitely agreeing to and accepting virtual training and attendance. So just keep it up. I'm glad I haven't seen anyone on a spill in a while, but spring's coming. The ground is moving. So be safe, be sane and sanitized, I say to everyone. And no, thank you, Shannon. You guys did a great job. Really good.
I had a question. I just would like to know, in your experience, what do you find are the pinch points for responders when it comes to wildlife on their spill sites? Where can they improve, and what don't they know?
I think general responders know way more than they think that they know, and they're scared to start because of you hear these stories like someone was fined under the Wildlife Act, or somebody was fined under the Migratory Birds Act. That I've never been on a spill where I've had DFO or the federal government or even the provincial government say you shouldn't have done that. You should have waited till you got a piece of paper. So I think that we get hung up on not having the permits, but there's so much that you can do prior to getting permits, or even getting to the point where you need permits, that shouldn't be a hang up for you. And also, like, people, they want to do things and they want to do things the right way, but with wildlife mitigation, there is no right way. Like, the more random it is, the better off it is. You are like, you need to move your deterrence on a regular basis. Sounds should be random. So you want to, don't get hung up on it being perfect, because there is no perfect. The less perfect it is, the better it usually works.
That's a really good point. I wanted to know, when you talk about pitfall traps, I assume those require an emergency one call.
Usually we can install pitfall. It depends. Like your ground disturbance permits change from client to client. We do observe general ground disturbance protocols if we're going to be disturbing the earth more than 30 centimeters, but we're digging them in by hand as well. So it's not as pertinent, I guess, as if you're you're installing T-posts with a post pounder and you're not entirely sure, especially because a lot of times when we're doing that with wildlife fencing, we're working around pipelines too. So we kind of forget that there's, this is a ground disturbance and there's other things that we could potentially hit by doing that. So easy solution is we just if I kind of have an idea of where wildlife fencing should go, when we do emergency one call for the spill itself, get them to sweep the area that your wildlife fencing is going in as well. And then, that doubles for pitfall traps. It can help you as well.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you. Those are my questions. I'm not sure if there's any other questions. I know there's some interest in maybe obtaining a copy of that slide for permitting, for all the information where you can obtain that. And you had mentioned the protocol 003 and 007.
Yeah.
I wonder if maybe there's like a one pager that you and I could work on together just to hand out to these attendees. Would that be something that we could do?
Yeah, I think that's a really good idea. I think it can get really confusing. And I mean, you guys heard one of the questions that was asked of Holly was about releasing wildlife. And I mean, there's so much confusion just provincially and federally trying to get our regulators to work together. I mean, realistically, it can change whether or not you're dealing with AER versus AEP. So I think it's good to have that kind of standardized sort of information that at least you have an idea where to start, right?
Yeah. And that's great advice too, to have sort of a canned wildlife plan, but with, of course, the understanding that it's going to change with each spill. Just having that foundation is great. Okay, well, I'm not seeing any other questions. So why doesn't everybody just take a couple minutes just to stretch? And Sherree, I'll let you pull up the workshop and we'll just come back in 2 minutes. Everybody can just have a quick little bio break.
Okay. Okay, I'm back. You guys are super pumped about that. Good news, my cat's still sleeping and has not started howling yet. So we can hopefully get through these exercises before she wakes up. So what you see here on your screen is a scenario and then a list of, it's an inventory list of things that you have available at your disposal to deal with this incident. So I'll go through the incident and then you guys can just unmute yourself or in the chat function, tell me what you would do in this scenario. Again, remember that there's no right or wrong answer. There's no exam at the end of this. You're not going to fail, but definitely try to, participate as much as possible. Gives you guys some good ideas of what you can do if you encounter these types of spills. So the first scenario is January 12th, Highway 40. A tank truck rollover results in the estimated release of 25 cubic meters of produced water and 5 cubic meters of diesel into a ditch. There's a culvert nearby and the closest access to WCSS wildlife equipment is approximately 2 hours away once transportation is mobilized. You're the only person on scene. After carrying out a hazard assessment, you ensure that the driver is okay, but will require medical attention. EMS is en route. using the inventory provided, draw out your deterrent strategy. So you guys can start just giving some feedback as to what you would do using that list of equipment there on this situation or in this spill scenario. Don't be shy. Anybody? What do you see here? What's one of the first things that you would do?
Yeah, I would start taking the fence posts, the steel stake fence posts, putting around the spill itself and containing it with the snow fence and the silt, putting the silt down as well. And I'd kind of do the same thing with the fish net to cover that drainage on the west side as well.
That's really good. Yeah, I like that idea. We've definitely got some access to wildlife fencing, so you can put some wildlife fencing up here. And you mentioned too about trying to prevent the spilled fluids from migrating. So you're trying to contain your spill fluids. So that is a good suggestion.
Yeah, and on that west side ditch as well would be one of the more important places to put anything for capture.
Yeah.
Couple from the chat, plan to fence off both sides of the culvert.
Okay. Yeah, you can definitely do that.
Go ahead, sorry. And then number 11, which is fence posts, 13 fence, silt fence, 14 snow fence, 8 car lot flagging, 24 pie plates, 28 windsock, 29 windsock pole, and 8 again car lot flagging.
Right. Those are good suggestions, and all things that you can use to install both physical, again, for birds, and wildlife fencing around your spill site. I do like the suggestion of the windsock. We don't know in this situation whether it's a sour product, but it's always good to know just what direction the wind is coming from in case there's a situation that you might need to deal with as well. Anybody else? What about the culvert? Is there anything anybody would do with that?
I would see if I could blow up one of those scary eye balloons inside the culvert to plug it up, or keep it plugged.
Yeah, use the scary eye as a culvert plug. I mean, hey, you do what you got to do in a pinch, right? Definitely, though, consider blocking the culvert for sure. One of, again, the things when you're a spill responder that you need to consider is containment, and containment first off, and making sure that you don't have flow through that culvert would be a really good idea at helping to contain your spill. And that effectively also reduces the amount of area that wildlife habitat that's going to be impacted in the long run. Anybody else?
A coyote statue to keep the deer away.
Yep.
A screen off culvert and silt fencing.
Yeah, very good. Good suggestions, you guys.
Start with a fence to be the southeast there.
Yep, sure.
Path of ungulates.
For sure. Yep, you could do that.
Set up the bald eagle statue to deter other birds in the area.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you definitely have a bird there, so some effigies would be great.
We'd like to get the windsock and pole up so we can determine which way the wind's coming from if we need to.
Yep. Yeah, that's a really good point. Getting that windsock up would be helpful for you for vapors from the spill.
Some sort of fence or something to keep the small animals from going up the culvert towards the spill.
Yeah. Anything else that you guys would do with the culvert?
There's a couple comments, plug the culvert and fencing and block the culvert.
Excellent. Yeah, one of very important thing to do. Again, we are maybe wildlife responders, but one thing, if you have the ability to prevent spill fluids from migrating further, do so. So blocking that culvert would be a really good idea. Anybody else?
So this isn't a sour product, I assume. This is a sweet product. I know we don't state that, but
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we're going to assume that.
Okay, and then the volume leaked. That the first thing that came to my mind was the AR will have to be notified, and transportation. I mean, this is an off-highway vehicle, right? So I think some notifications need to take place as well, right?
Yep, you bet. Yeah, so those notifications would happen. Whatever your reporting structure is in your company would be how you would report it. Anybody else, any of these other things that are on this inventory list that you can think of or would like to use around the spill site?
You could probably set up your favorite toy, which is the pie plates.
Right, yeah. Pie plates are always, you know, I like to say there's a couple of things just as oil field people that are really good to have on you at all times, in addition to the things that you normally carry. But for if you deal with spills, for example, pie plates and flagging tape, they don't take up a lot of room. They're cheap and they're really easy to set up, really fast, and they do a wonderful job at deterring wildlife. So if you don't have, you know, a couple pie plates kicking around, that's fine. If you have the ability to get some, it might look odd carrying, you know, 5 pie plates in your truck, but maybe as you finish your pie, you can just throw them in the back seat. I don't know, but just they're really good to have on hand. So anybody else?
I think my first step would be to somehow try to block off that culvert as best I could.
Really good. Excellent. That is something that you should be doing right away. Again, what I said at the very beginning, no part of a spill response should hinder another. When you're the first guy on scene, you've got to assess the entire situation. So think about what's going on. And again, you don't want to create more flow paths than or a larger area of impact than what is happening at that moment. So one of the first things you should do, or that I would do too, it would be to block off that culvert.
So you're saying, have you already provided first aid to the driver? Like definitely want to have rescue and first aid coming first.
Yeah.
I would say even before the culvert.
Right, yeah. So we're assuming that the driver's okay.
Okay.
I think it says that he requires medical attention, but EMS is en route. So you're good to go in that regard.
What is the type of culvert? Like, is it like a ditch culvert or is it a like culvert from a wetland?
I think where it looks like on a highway. So I'm just going to say it's a ditch culvert.
Okay. So there's no potential for like fish?
No.
What about isolating the leak itself if you have the skills to do so? Like
sure, absolutely. I guess I don't have the skills to do that. So we're going to assume again that there's no, we don't have the skills to isolate the leak.
What I would do, the first steps would be install a 6-foot fence around the spill.
Okay.
Start analyzing the dirt to see how far your spill is gone, to see how much you need to fence off. And then second, start getting a roadblock set up and navigating traffic around your spill so you're not traveling that spill farther down the road on tires. That's
a good points. Yep. Like this. So we've got some wildlife fencing. Anybody else in terms of wildlife? What you're the first guy on the scene, what would you do?
You could put your flagging and deterrence up, and then your flagging could be used for 2 things. One, to kind of keep wildlife away, but then also kind of more of a visual aid to determine how big the area is expanding, if it's a slower leak or if it's just contained. And it'd be relatively easy for one person to go and grab that flagging and start getting it out.
Yeah, I really like that idea. I think that's something, just killing 2 birds with 1 stone, if you will. You're kind of delineating your spill area, which is information that you're going to need to know anyway, and also setting up some visual deterrence for wildlife. So anybody else? I will show you what I would do in this situation. Maybe. If I can go forward here. There we go. Okay. So blocked culvert, definitely for sure. I like to put up I have access to fencing, so I'm going to put up some wildlife fencing just to keep wildlife from coming into my work area. Got some scarecrows happening there. You could put up some Mylar tape on the top of your fencing or on your fencing in general. Something that I considered was I have wildlife movement in the bottom, like south end of my site. So I'm gonna, there's no spilled fluids there. So I have really no reason to prevent wildlife from moving through there as long as it's not impacting our efforts to contain and recover the spill. It should be no problem. So keep the wildlife, keep them moving through that area. So consider making it a restricted access area for things like your laydown or your equipment. And that might just keep them, moving through there and not disturbing your spill site. Something else to consider, you guys, when you're working on roadways like this is you might need highway control and you might need them right away. Things like, and if you don't have access to it, that is fair. That happens often. But things like wavy men and scarecrows, and the more flashy your site is, it's also can be distracting to drivers. So you want to make sure that your personal safety and that the safety of other people using that roadway are also maintained. So just, be cognizant of the fact that you might have traffic on there that's going to be distracted by your spill site.
What about protecting yourself by carrying the bear spray and banger?
Yeah, definitely. You want to make sure that especially if you're a wildlife biologist on the site, or if you're doing hazing, for example, that you have stuff available to you, like your bear bangers or bear spray to protect you in those situations. So that's a really good idea. If you have it, definitely take it with you and be prepared to use it if you have to.
And another one may need people to man 24 hours a day based on the requirement to keep the road open.
100%. Yeah, that goes back to what I was just saying. If you can get highway control, that is really helpful. Not just for safety, your personal safety and the safety of your workers, but also for people traveling on that roadway. So something to consider is definitely getting either 24-hour surveillance or highway control out there. So anyone have anything else to add before we move on to the next one? So same thing as the last one. You've got some supplies on one side and the scenario on the other. Again, don't get caught up on the scale. Some people we've had in the past that kind of dwell on the fact that there's a very large beaver, as Shannon likes to point out. But you get the idea, right? There's wildlife present. It's a creek spill. So September 24th, Poplar Hillside, known to be a good location for hunting elk, moose, and deer. A pipeline leak has been detected and containment and recovery are underway. It's estimated that approximately 20 cubic meters of crude oil has been spilled into the adjacent creek that is also popular salmon run. Using the inventory available from WCSS Wildlife Unit, draw your deterrent strategy and indicate what information you'll collect and provide to the wildlife biologist when he or she arrives on site. So you guys have a double whammy here. Tell me how you would set up your deterrent strategy or your wildlife mitigation strategy, and what type of information would you collect to provide to the wildlife biologist that's on their way. Anybody have any suggestions? What would you put up there?
Snow fence, silt fence, bear bangers, carlot flagging.
Okay.
As well as poles and fence the spill path to the river.
Okay. Sounds like somebody's gearing up to set up some wildlife fencing and to put up maybe some carlot flagging across the creek.
I'd probably throw a wavy man by the creek to try to deter the fish away from coming downstream.
Okay. It's a good suggestion. You guys have access to wavy man. Might be good to deter wildlife from the area. So you could definitely throw one of those up there. Anybody have any suggestions of information that you'd collect while you were out there?
The type of migrating wildlife that's going throughout the area while you guys are doing the clean spill up and prepping.
Absolutely. That's something that's really good and really important. So we've got, looks like, a number of different types of wildlife that are moving through that area. A lot of you too are familiar, you're in these areas all the time, so you're familiar with them. You might, have had incidental sightings of different, moose or elk or bear or whatever, any type of wildlife that you see in these areas when you're working out there on a regular basis. Let us know when we get there. That's super helpful. Again, if you have, in this situation, it looks like, this wildlife is present right now, let us know too. So we might, by the time, we get out there, they might be gone, but it gives us a kind of good starting point for what we can expect when we arrive. So thank you. Anybody else have any ideas of what you'd throw up there? Anybody using a Zon gun or any noisemakers, anything like that?
I was going to say the Zon gun at first, but would you not want to try to contact where the spill's coming from to get like the SDS for you guys as well for these animals?
Yeah. One of the things that I always ask for when I arrive on site, and I have multiple different roles when I'm out there. One of them is wildlife, of course, but water quality too. And if you can provide the SDS or MSDS, whatever you guys call them nowadays, that is so helpful for us, because we know then I have a good idea by looking at that what's going to be the toxicological effects to the wildlife that are out there. And it gives me a good starting point of what to look for in the, when we're sending samples to the lab as well. So very important. And thank you very much for suggesting that. Anybody do any wildlife fencing here? And if you would, how would you put it up?
I was probably thinking of going on each side of the spill, from where the beaver is on the right side, heading left to where the moose is, to keep the animals from going cross-contaminating through our area as well, because we're going to have people plus all the contaminants of the oil spill as well.
Yeah, good point. Again, you can set up a wildlife fence in this situation however you want to do it. Like I said before, and I'll say again, the beauty of wildlife mitigation is that it's not, you set it up and it's there forever. You can move these things. If it doesn't feel right or it's not working, that's fine. You can move it, no problem at all. So yeah, you can set up a wildlife fence across kind of that zone of red zone or most heavily contaminated zone, and prevent wildlife from tracking through there. Also kind of gives you, an area of like an area, a work area, so that you have less to decon at the end of the day too. Any other suggestions here?
This would be going to be a good scenario to put those pails in the ground, would it not? For amphibious.
Like pitfall traps, you mean? Yeah.
That is pitfall traps, thank you.
Yeah, for sure. Pretty much any scenario where you have water around is a good situation to put up pitfall traps. Be mindful of the time of year. You don't need to dig in pitfall traps if you're, for amphibians anyway, if you're in the winter months, because they will be hibernating. But absolutely, you may as well, if you're going to install wildlife fence, do it right for sure. Like, make sure that if you're going to put fencing up, that it's functioning and practical fencing. And then you may throw in some pitfall traps as well.
Would you do anything for fish in the river, like the fish net?
100%. Yeah. One of the things that we often do, especially in situations like this, is we will fence upstream and downstream, usually immediately upstream and as close to the hot area as we can on the downstream side, around the spill site, or to not the spill site, but in the creek at the point of entry. And what that does is normally unfortunately, the fish that are in that heavily contaminated zone they're usually heavily impacted, and their chances of survival are pretty slim. But we do want to prevent them from moving out of that area, because we don't want to encourage bioaccumulation. So having an oiled fish, for example, move downstream, and that bear there eat the salmon, that's all dirty and bioaccumulate, so transferring contaminants. So absolutely, if you have the opportunity to install that netting, get it in there as well.
Bear banger to clear out the large wildlife.
Yeah, so we do have some, I don't know necessarily if they're aggressive or not, but people are generally, they're a little bit, don't like bears that much. So you can absolutely use those bear bangers or doing some active hazing to move them out of the area. Air horns work great. And you have a number of those in your WCSS trailers. So use those air horns and bear bangers to move the moose and the bear out of the area as well. What about what information would you collect to provide to your biologists when they arrive on site?
Known wildlife in the area.
Yeah, that's a good thing to do. Definitely. Looks like we've got some moose, some bears, some beavers. So if you see those, definitely report those. That's vital information, important information for that we would like to know when we get there.
Product information?
Absolutely. Product information is really important. I can't stress enough how much, like, you need to look at your SCS, even if you're like, wow, it's produced water or it's oil emulsion, like I know what's in it. There's a lot of different, from a water quality perspective, for example, there's a lot of different chemicals that can be in there. So if you get an SDS, it not only helps us to protect ourselves in terms of what PPE we might need, but also gives us kind of a guideline of where, toxicology to certain animals, for example, and where to start, what to look for in terms of monitoring those products as well.
Sherree, question on up and downstream for recreational boaters or fishermen, right? ATV enthusiasts,
Yeah.
This type of, would you put up barricades up and downstream just to keep?
Yeah, if you, absolutely. Anytime that you're putting something into the water, even boom, for example, you want to make sure that if it's on a navigable water course, and what they define as navigable is anything that you can float a watercraft down. So if you can float a raft down it, they consider it navigable. You want to let Nav Canada know that this is what's happening. So this stuff is in the water, and you should be putting up both up and downstream signs, letting boaters and recreational users know that you've got, that there's something in the water. Absolutely. Very good point.
There's another comment to definitely use a Braco buoy to make lots of noise.
Yeah, for sure. That's a good thing too. Don't underestimate the power of your equipment, right? To be able to, like, whatever you have on hand. Again, things that make noise are great deterrents for a lot of wildlife. Just again, be mindful of the fact that wildlife get used to things really easily. So if you can't move it, or can't, whatever you're using if it's specific to wildlife mitigation, that you need to be moving the locations of that or changing up the sounds on a regular basis.
How about if there's any local facilities that support this pipeline with shops or anything like that close by that could be used as potential wash stations or equipment because it gets to night type of a staging area?
Yeah, so if we don't have the ability to transport impacted wildlife to a rehabilitation facility, we're going to need to have companies like Holly's come in and do washing work for us, like cleanup work. So, I mean, on our sites, we always think about where our decon areas are, so deconning people and equipment, but we don't think about where we're going to clean up wildlife. That's often overlooked. So that's a really good point. If there's any facilities nearby that you can use as your kind of triage station, then absolutely get in contact with those guys, and something to think about for sure. Any other comments?
You could put up some noise on the other side.
Could do that, yep. Like some zon cannons.
Maybe another animals on the other side to keep them from coming across.
Sure.
Maybe some posts with some flagging, kind of deter them, some things moving.
Yeah, you got lots and lots and lots of area to keep to put lots of different types of kites or windsocks or wavy men, whatever you like in that area as well. Anybody else? Okay, so I will show you what I did. So again, because I couldn't fence the entire area off, I wanted to install my fencing just in a place to keep wildlife out of my active work zone. My wildlife fencing, again, it's not basically creating a giant obstacle around my work area. It's just to keep wildlife from moving down that fence line and out of my work area or the impact area. So I've got different types of scarecrows and scary eyes and Mylar tape attached to my fencing. You could throw in some Zon cannons there if you wanted to as well. Or the bird guard, whichever suits your fancy. You want to definitely do some active hazing in this area because it looks like that you have some wildlife that you're going to need to move out of the area. Since you have a giant bear, you're going to want to engage a wildlife biologist, or even make sure, you know, if you have the opportunity, call your local trapper so that they can help you too. Those guys are highly skilled and they know what they're doing around wildlife. So I talked a little bit about attractants and kind of providing an area for wildlife when we deter them, when we're displacing them, giving them an area to go to. So you can see on the south area, I have a restricted access area. And what I mean by that is it looks like it's about the same type of habitat as where the wildlife were coming from. So we're giving them a place to go that's not impacted and that also is not going to have people running around in it or have a lay down area or anything like that. So we're going to give our displaced wildlife some place to go. Any comments or questions?
What about pennant flagging over top of your containment area?
Yeah, you could 100% do that. So pennant flagging, you want to make sure that you're not kind of interfering with, so you've got a boom set there and the skimmer, you want to maybe keep it out of that work area because we're going to have people in there. But you can set up pennant flagging, really good idea. Pennant flagging, again, if you're going to use it to keep waterfowl from landing on water surfaces, you want to set them at 10-meter intervals. And that, again, physically prevents birds from landing on your creek. So great, that's a great idea. Anybody else?
Yeah, sure. It's Mark. I'm just wondering, and it's hard to tell with the drawing how wide that creek is, whether fish fencing in the creek itself to prevent fish, especially if it's salmon spawning, depending on the time of year, obviously, whether it would be in certain situations. Wide rivers, obviously you can't, but in this one here, would it be feasible?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the answer is, I don't know because we don't have a scale on here. But assuming you're in a small enough water course, it's a good idea to kind of, if that's where a screen comes in handy, or it prevents pretty much everything from like small fish to large fish from entering that spill area. So you could set up block vents upstream and downstream. You do, again, need to have a fish research license in order to do that. So that's something that you want to engage your wildlife biologists for. One thing to keep in mind is that when we're doing spills, often, unfortunately, the animals that are inside that spill area are heavily impacted by hydrocarbons. So sometimes even if we're trying to remove them, because you have to pull them out over the surface of the water that's oiled. I mean, it's very difficult to remove fish from an impact area and not have them be impacted. So oftentimes the DFO will say whatever's inside that work area is basically we're recovering, and they're usually kind of a write-off, like they're dead. So you're going to be reporting them as wildlife mortalities. So it's just something to keep in mind. But yeah, you definitely, if it's small enough and feasible, throw some block nets in there, both upstream and downstream, just to isolate the heavily impacted areas. And you might have to, you know, downstream have a look, and you could wildlife fence if you need to, if you've got a lot of accumulation of hydrocarbons in like a back eddy or something. You might want to you might want to think about putting up deterrents in those areas to prevent or kind of keep wildlife from accessing them. Thing about hydrocarbons is it smells, and it might not be appealing to us, but it is really appealing to a lot of animals that are curious about it as well. So the last one is June 15th, Prairie Pothole area. An oil well releases 30 cubic meters of emulsion that is migrated into a nearby slough, which is also a water source for cattle in the fields. Containment recovery equipment has been installed by 6 contract laborers at the direction of the company representatives and with the assistance of the company's internal response group. The WCSS Wildlife Unit has just arrived, but not everybody is familiar with its contents. Some orientation is required. A wildlife biologist is en route to the incident and has requested that deterrent strategies be put in place. Using the inventory available to you, draw out your wildlife deterrent strategy. So we have a couple of kind of interesting things happening here. One is domestic livestock. So yeah, what would you guys do in this situation?
It's not on the list here, but one of the first things we do is get a hold of whoever the owner of the cattle or the lease or private land. Even though it's got containment, you still want to move those cattle out of there because they're just going to be attracted to the activity. And
absolutely, yeah. Yeah, 100%. One of the very first things we do is contact the landowner or leaseholder and see if they can move their cattle out of the area. That's really, really important.
You'd want to fence off around the water source.
Yep, you can fence off around the water source. You can either, in this situation, we had somebody mention yesterday that they would silt fence it. You could do that or install wildlife and silt fencing combined together for sure. That's a good idea. One thing I think I forgot to mention was the fact that birds there are some types of, I guess, physical deterrents for them. Generally, when they approach landing, they're coming in at a 30-degree angle. So our go-to is if you're going to install flagging or car lot flagging, pendant flagging across your water course or water body to keep them away, install them at 10-meter increments. And that 10-meter increment is enough to physically prevent them from landing on your pond or your water body.
I was going to say, and document whoever the first responders are, is if you can snap a few photos of the cattle and where their proximity is. And if there's a bunch of tracks, take pictures of that as well. And depending on how many cattle there are, try to document the tag numbers of the ones that were potentially drinking or at the source of the failure, the spill release, because that could be crucial for treating the animals after.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really, really good point. Like I said before, if you think it's important, write it down. If you don't think it's important, write it down. So things like if you can document that information, that is really great to know. And honestly, it helps us in the long run too. So yeah, if you have the ability to write down tag numbers or you take photos, absolutely do that. About for got some ducks there. What would you guys do? How would you try to prevent other waterfowl from landing on that pond or getting rid of the ones that are there?
Could use the owl or the eagle statues again.
Yeah, for sure. Any of the effigies, the birds of prey or kites, the owl, those would be a great solution for mitigating waterfowl.
The cannons usually work good to get birds off the water.
Absolutely. So Zon cannons are a really, really great tool in this situation. They would be a really great tool as well. Something to mention about Zon cannons is you want to set them at not always the loudest setting or like the most frequent settings. You want to make sure that they're random all the time. So you can change that up and adjust it depending on the Zon cannon, by turning the propane up or down, basically. More propane, louder, more frequent booms, less propane, less boom, right? So Zon cannons are great. Be aware with Zon cannons that they get really hot. So fire extinguishers, that's something that you want to have close by to your Zon cannons. And if it's really dry out, make sure that you're watching them really closely, or that you're not using them, because we've set a few grass fires with Zon cannons. So
Sherree, quick question. If those ducks or there's other waterfowls already, coated with that oil, would you still proceed with setting up a Zon cannon? Like, what takes precedence, looking after or, maintaining and stabilizing those affected animals, or preventing more from coming?
I don't know the answer to what takes precedence. I think it depends on, again, as they're only trained individuals are allowed to capture wildlife or deal with oiled wildlife. So if it's you on the site, I would think that what would take precedent would be, those oiled wildlife or the oiled ducks. You keep an eye on where their location is, and let your wildlife biologist know as soon as they get there that this is where they are, and that this waterfowl is oiled. And then you guys, you're the 6 guys that are out there, and the spill group, it doesn't take 6 guys to watch some ducks. So I'd be setting up my deterrents right away, because you definitely don't want to have to deal with more oiled wildlife too. So
No, agreed. It said that the unit was there, just needed orientation. So
yeah.
There's a few comments here for scaring them away. The owl statue, Zon gun, wavy man, a gun, and bear banger would scare them. Carlot flagging as well.
Yeah, again, any of those auditory deterrents would be really good in this situation. You could even put the bird guard up somewhere, depending on what the actual scale of it was. If you've got a really large pond, maybe on the other side away from people, you could set up your bird guard and Zon cannons, anything that makes noise. And you've got people too that are there that can actively haze wildlife out of the area, right? In this situation, it looks like the biggest wildlife factor that you have to deal with is waterfowl and the cattle. So it should be, if you have to wait, you're waiting for the landowner to come and move the cows, then you might have to unfortunately just chase them away until they can be moved. So active hazing as well.
Yeah, you could use some of those guys to actually, instead of while you guys are setting up the fence, to slowly herd the cattle away from the area at the same time.
Yeah, very good point. If you can't get the landowner out there, and even because it's going to take them a while, and it may take them a while to actually move all those cattle, you do have, it looks like, some people at your disposal at the moment, so you can get them to haze those cattle. Just even keep them away. You don't need to be chasing them like far away from that spill site, but keeping them away from the water would probably be a good idea.
Just one other suggestion, to use the Zon gun in the chat there.
Yeah, the Zon gun in this situation might be a really good idea. Some things to keep in mind about the bird guard and the Zon gun. I think I touched on it a little bit. The bird guards the ones that WCSS have play birds of prey calls. So if you're going to use the bird guard, for example, try to have a good idea of what's wildlife are in your area. And it doesn't hurt to look at the little key on this. There's a box that you attach the speaker to in the Zon, or on, I keep saying Zon gun, on the bird guard, that tells you what calls they are. So if it's not going to be make or break your spill, but sometimes you can bring scavenger species in with your bird guard, or species that you're trying to deter are going to be attracted to those noises as well. If you're using the Zon gun, good suggestion. It's at your disposal. A couple of things about any auditory deterrent: you can't use them in provincial or federal parks. So if you're working in Banff for some reason, which would be awesome, You can't use audio deterrents. They can wear on people's nerves. Also, if you've got lots of workers present, you don't want to be using auditory deterrents because it gets pretty annoying after a while. But keep them random as possible. So your Zon cannons, by adjusting the amount of propane that's going through it, you can adjust the sound and the frequency, and that will just keep that random and keep them moving all the time, like your other deterrents. So maybe once a day, move the location of your Zon cannon or your bird guard. Also with Zon cannons, they do get really, really hot on the end of them. So there are stands for them, but make sure that you have a fire extinguisher available that's close and on hand. And, you know, you need to check them. So don't set them and just leave them there for all, you know, overnight or for days on end. We have been known to start grass fires with Zon cannons because of the temperature of the barrel. So something to keep in mind with them as well. Anybody else with any suggestions?
There's a question here. If that is the only source of drinking water for cattle, who is responsible for supplying clean drinking water?
I do not know the answer to that question. I would imagine that, I don't know, to be honest with you. I think it's probably would boil down to it being the spill owner's responsibility to provide drinking water for that cattle, but that would be between the landowner and the spill owner. So if you can, this goes back to document. If you think it's important, write it down. If you don't think it's important, write it down. Documenting tags or, you know, what cattle are in the area, that can help in the long run too, with just in case there's anything that happens to those cattle down the line. All right, so I've got lots of effigies all over. One of the things that I opted for as well, move the cows obviously, was to install car lot flagging or pennant flagging. Rope with flagging tape on it is fine too, across the water body. Again, I didn't mention this earlier on in my presentation, but I just told you guys that because of the angle that birds land at, we usually try to keep our flags set at 10-meter increments, and that physically will prevent them from landing on the pond. So it's something to keep in mind as well. Just again, you guys, there's no right or wrong answers with wildlife and all of this stuff. Like, it might be like this on the first day, but it's certainly not going to be like this on the second day, because we're constantly moving things. So all of the effigies are going to be moved on a regular basis for sure. Make sure you're moving. If you're not working, they're not working. So make sure that those things are being moved regularly. Does anybody else have any questions or comments before I turn it over to Shannon again here? All right, thank you guys.
All right, thank you very much, Sherree. Hopefully you guys found that to be a useful exercise. Yeah, the scale is what you'd like for it to be when you're going through those. So yes, please do use those. And I'd love to get some feedback from you if you are using them at safety meetings. If you have some recommendations, we're happy to hear them. So as you can see, Amy's just uploading the PowerPoint group exercise for you there. So I would just like to thank you guys all for being here, for showing up and attending this webinar. I think it went really well. This is showing me that it's a really great way to have this conversation with multiple people. I do, again, hope that you found it useful. And just a couple of things I'd like to reiterate. If you have not been able to get your orientation video and knowledge checks done, please go ahead and do that. And then after that, we can give you your certificate. And actually, we have another webinar coming up for leadership in April. So April 20th, 21st, and 22nd. They're actually for zones 1 and 3. Zone 5, we're actually planning some field exercises, and we're going to be watching those gathering restrictions closely. And if we're not able to gather in person, we still have some backup options for you. So please do go ahead and check out our training page for any questions you may have, or feel free again to reach out to myself and or Amy. So once again, you guys are welcome to unmute yourselves, say thanks to our wonderful presenters, or give those thumbs up or whatever the emotion is. And I just would like to give a thumbs up to you guys. Thank you so much for being here and joining us. Okay, thanks so much. Take care.